Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2023 BHECN Core Topics webinar series. My name is Dr. Katie Quartz, and I'm a licensed psychologist at the University of Nebraska Medical Center and Associate Director of Education and Training for the Behavioral Health Education Center of Nebraska, also known as BHECN. On behalf of the Planning Committee, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you today. We are very excited you're here, and we hope you enjoy the webinar we have planned for you.
Hi, I'm Mike Colt, and I'm in my last semester of the Clinical Mental Health Counseling Program at UNK and a member of the BHECN Student Advisory Board. So today our speaker is Michael Stube. Michael is a licensed professional counselor and licensed mental health practitioner with Western Nebraska Behavioral Health. He's also a doctoral candidate in the Counselor Education Graduate Program at Oregon State University. He has traveled and worked in rural towns throughout the panhandle of Nebraska, helping to address a wide range of client needs. He has helped connect rural areas with expanded care through coordination with an outreach genetics clinic and an outreach pediatric psychiatry clinic. His clinical work is primarily focused on providing rural integrated care with a special interest in working with clients in the LGBTQIA+ community. Today, he'll be presenting Intersectionality of LGBTQ+ youths in rural settings, ethics and competencies. So welcome, Michael.
Thank you so much for the introduction. All right. Yes, so I will be talking about intersectionality of LGBTQ+ youths in rural settings, and really I'll be concentrating on the combination of factors that come together for LGBTQ+ youths with the issues and just the differences that come up in rural areas. And just to give a little bit more about myself, I do go by he, him, his. And as was mentioned previously, I have practiced for several years in Western Nebraska. I have ended up working in around 7 different communities throughout the Panhandle and Western Nebraska. I did get my master's in clinical mental health counseling from Chadron State, so I really had the education in that rural area too. And I am working on my doctorate in counselor education at Oregon State University with a research focus that really goes into rural populations specifically. And so I figured it would be good to just kind of give a layout of what I'll be talking about today. And we're going to start just talking about really the terminology and the vocabulary around LGBTQ+ populations. As for both clinical and research work, I think it was really important to look at current usage and just take that information and just repeatedly kind of look at the importance of staying informed with those. And I'll explain more as I go on what that looks like. In terms of intersectionality, I'm going to focus on those specific interactions between LGBTQ+ communities, rural culture, and youth culture. After that, I'll kind of look at the ethical concerns, and I'll end up connecting a lot of them to specific ACA code of ethics pieces that are important and that I think will come up when working with these populations. And when we come to the competencies, I'm really going to dive into just general structures, general practices, and competencies laid out by SAGE, a part of ACA that could be useful in practice with the time left over being dedicated to question and answers. And as just at the bottom, the disclaimer mentions, LGBTQ+ communities are not homogenous. And unfortunately, I won't have time to cover all identities or all topics related to these communities. But let's get started. So yes, starting off, getting into the terminology is such an important part when approaching LGBTQ+ communities. And so, as I mentioned, with the importance of this, it's an important part of the experience too. And I think the first part of building a competency when working with these populations and understanding how they intersect with different pieces is this initialism. which I brought over from SAGE. And these definitions come from the Human Rights Campaign. And I pulled them from that, but there's likely going to be differences in definitions. There's going to be variations in definitions when you're looking at these. And that's something I'll kind of touch on more later. And for the sake of just consistency and the sake of time and fluidity, when I talk through this and when I reference the larger communities, I'll more normally be using LGBTQ plus. Although when I look back for clinical and research work, I tend to use this larger initialism, LGBTGEQIAP plus, which is kind of defined from SAGE, which is the Society of Sexual, Affectional, Intersex, and Gender Expansive Identities. As I will talk more over time, the importance of these initialisms is going to be a kind of a foundation of understanding the vocabulary. And just to add, which is not included on this slide, the plus is really meant to include further identities and kind of a way to say, this is going to expand, this is going to change over time. I wanted to touch specifically on some of these to kind of give an understanding of what they might look like and what you, like as a clinician, people may run into. Some of these are definitely more specific and more defined to specific people, like lesbian, which is more focused on women and non-binary people who feel attraction to other women or non-binary people. And then we have other ones that are umbrella terms, which means that they kind of cover a large area or cover multiple populations, multiple communities within it. Some examples of those umbrella terms as defined on here is a term like gay, which is a person who is emotionally, romantically, or sexually attracted to members of the same gender. Another one is trans, which is meant to cover those that challenge social gender norms. And this is one specific identity, like a few other ones and many other ones, that usually a person has to self-identify as trans for it to be an appropriate way to describe them. Some more of the umbrella terms are gender expansive, which is more for those that are still exploring their gender and expression and identity, or queer, which identifies those who kind of identify outside of the heteronormative or the gender binary. One piece that I felt like it was important to say while talking about these is that there is a long history to some of these names, and there's also a history of them being used as a pejorative, them being used in a negative light. And I'll touch on kind of the transition of those and what that looks like with stigma as we go on, but it's important to kind of understand some of the histories related to those. Queer, for example, is one that younger people, I think, are more free to use for the most part, where older people, older generations might have more of a stigma attached to that and might not want to be identified or use that to identify themselves. A few of them that I thought need a little bit more of an explanation or a little bit more of an identifying were ones that have a cultural connection. Some of these aren't culturally connected, but ones like Two-Spirit are specifically connected to Native American culture and are not normally used outside of that culture to identify someone. I thought it was also important to mention ones that signify a lack of interest or a lack, whether it be partial or complete, like asexuality or aromantic. And then one that I thought was important that will come up later is the poly relationship systems, which is right at the end, but that is one that I think often is kind of forgotten or often not talked about as much. And then a term that's not on this list, but I did think was important because it's one that we're going to run into as clinicians and run into as possible self-identifiers, is cisgender, which is just to describe a person whose gender identity aligns with those typically associated with the sex assigned to them at birth. This will often be shortened to cis, and it will be a way that people describe themselves. This next part is something I'll really jump into as we continue, but there are terms that fall out of usage that are often used as derogatory or just kind of change as the vernacular changes. Like transsexual is not one that's often used now. And one that I thought was important, it was a big kind of, I would say, fully umbrella term, is things like sexual preference or orientations are kind of leaning on the outs. And I've been seeing the use of affectional identity being used as a descriptor, both to kind of cover a broader range and explain different facets of identity, but also to not be under the guise of like, this is a choice, where preference might be read as that. So a really big part of working with LGBTQ plus populations is that there's a changing vernacular over time, and it changes rather quickly. And another piece of that is that there's often going to be terms or definitions that are different for different individuals. And I'll talk more about the importance and the place that the vocabulary has in practice as we continue. But a big piece of both competency and a part that can cause some confusion is because of the fact that the language develops rapidly. And it can sometimes be a challenge to keep up to date on the terminology. When I touch on some of the reasons behind the quickly changing terminology, the first part that is what happens when we use it in a negative way, or we use it in an outdated way. Part of the reason why the terms change over time and why there is such a quick change is that they can become derogatory or be used in a derogatory way over time. And there can be stigma attached to those. And I think we see that most clearly. And most clearly the changes over time with words like gay or queer. And I'll go into more detail later, but outdated terms used in sessions or used with clients can create a rupture, which often can go unspoken, and it can feel like a break kind of in the safety that they expect when going into a therapeutic environment. And I will say the rapid change is something that I've both heard and felt some frustration myself with, trying to stay confident, because when I mess up, when I use an outdated term or cause a rupture, it feels like a personal failure. And I just wanted to kind of touch on some of the reasons why there's that rapid change. And one piece of it is that there is new technology, there's the internet, there's different ways to connect that created an increase in the speed of communication and allowed for more communication between cultures, subcultures, different communities, where words might go back and forth, they might change, they might connect. And then, as I mentioned before, there's changes because stigma becomes attached to it. Another big example that's fallen out of usage for the most part is homosexuality. Another reason that we do change it over time is that we get better definitions over time. We tend to get more specific, which allows us to better work with and understand the terms that we have. A piece of this kind of in the broader culture that I wanted to touch on is that we are socialized to use gendered language. And I think that's been something that's been called into question a lot recently. We've been dealing with the socialization that starts our language since the day we're born. And over time, we kind of see that and figure it out. And like I mentioned earlier, there is a frustration on those of us that are trying to keep up to date with the vocabulary, because we do have to fight some of that gendered language and fight the socialization. And giving ourselves grace, I think, in those moments while still changing is really important. A piece of this that I think is important too is that I feel like over the last few years and recent years, there's been a more openness to express kind of those affectional identities, gender expression, and that has created kind of new pieces that we're fitting in. So intersectionality is kind of the big piece, the thing that pulls this together. And I wanted to give just a definition or two so we can best understand what that means for intersectionality and what it means to look at intersecting identities. So kind of the short definition that I've given before is that it's defined as points of intersection of people's multiple identities, because that's really something that comes together, is that we all have different pieces, different identities that we fall under, that we feel connected to. To go into more depth, I would say that another definition is that it looks at the interconnected nature of these social categories that we're kind of put into. And that's looking at things like race, class, gender, and regarded as those times of overlapping and interdependent systems that have discrimination or disadvantage. So in kind of the broader case of what I'll be speaking about, a big part of it is looking at the discrimination that LGBTQ plus youths experience while looking at the interconnected kind of web that comes with some of the disadvantages that can happen when living in rural places. So looking at these different identities and how they might come together, looking at the rural issues that the population deals with, just a very brief explanation before I get too far in depth, is that there's often a lack of like behavioral and medical health care. There are cultural views and stigmas, both related to that mental health care and towards identity. Looking at LGBTQ plus communities, these populations can be exploring their identities. They can be dealing with discrimination based on their outward expression or other affectional identity pieces that they come out with. When it comes to youth, they're kind of a unique group because they're dealing with a growing independence. They're working on exploring who they are, not just based on their affectional identity, but their place in the world. And while they're doing that, they're developing peer groups. They're still kind of dealing with the independence that they're growing, living at home and moving out of the house. And these all come together as different pieces kind of the puzzle of intersectionality. So just to go a little bit further into this, looking at some of the research and some of the studies done, looking at both rural populations, LGBTQ plus populations, and youth, is that they aren't researched as often. And while pulling together information for this, one term that I found was metronormativity, which can kind of just be summed up as the heavy lean towards urban and suburban populations and research on those. And this not only continues to be a thing when looking into rural populations and not being as much of a focus, but it also comes up with LGBTQ plus populations where there may be a focus of looking at those urban and suburban communities. And so there have been multiple studies that talk about disparities that rural populations deal with in behavioral health and medical care. And some of these have found that there continues to be just a compounding of those disparities with rural LGBTQ plus populations. A conclusion of one of these studies that I've included in the references is that those that fall into both will experience increased rates of unemployment. And it's that they're experiencing the rural ones with increased stresses. So increased rates of unemployment, just diminished access to affordable housing. And those are things that rural populations have to deal with, but then have an increased amount of stress while managing their identity. And then I'll go into more detail in the next slide, but there's a phenomenological study done by Roberts that look into rural LGBTQ plus high school experiences and have found several themes that arise, which include things like homophobia. They deal with institutional heterosexism or discursive violence. And this talked, as I mentioned on this slide, about looking through it at the minority stress theoretical lens, which speaks to the fact that minority populations will deal with stressors that are both distal and proximal, with distal being those that are societal wide, things like discrimination, while proximal are more internal, like identity concealment. They're hiding or still working with their identity, while discursive violence is defined as communication styles, which could include words, gestures, tones, or images that represent LGBTQ plus identities in a negative or degrading light. And I think this is a really good study to look into, specifically because there are some really notable quotes that come from it. Like one participant spoke about how they had to keep a piece of them in check during school. So they were watching and hiding a part of their identity and holding it back because they felt like it wouldn't be accepted or there would just be negative consequences to them expressing that identity in public. So looking more into that experience and a few studies that kind of surround this intersectionality is that LGBTQ plus rural youth are more likely than their urban counterparts to experience homophobic remarks and victimization at school. One piece of the Cosquick study, which I'll include in the references, is that the homophobic language used was often connected to a similar language use in admired adults. And I think this can kind of go to show that while there is I think a changing over time with acceptance with LGBTQ plus communities, that the older population, sometimes in rural areas, can still hold some of these negative views and use that language more freely at home, which then ends up coming through at school or in public for their children. And then I've mentioned that when talking about rural research, but there is often a focus on just the underutilization of healthcare. And Roberts went into this a little bit, kind of expanding about this lack of access in rural areas and touching on the fact that sometimes when looking for providers, that LGBTQ plus youth will feel like they, for one, have a hard time finding different access points, but also there might be a lack of provider knowledge about LGBTQ plus issues. They might experience forms of like invisibility in the healthcare system. They may see still stigma, stereotyping, and a sense of invasiveness in the medical setting. Another important note from Roberts that I wanted to touch on is that it's something that I've heard myself from teens, and in rural areas, there's this feeling that they will wait until college to get more support. And they will come out there because they feel like they're going to not only get more support from people around them, but get more support from staff and systems around them. And Roberts went on that tangent and talked about the idea that the education systems should really lean away from that idea of the waiting perspective and lean towards more specifically education and giving LGBTQ plus support in schools. I wanted to include just a few pieces of the interactions with the school that they found. They talked about 76% of these rural school staff reporting that they felt they were providing a safe environment for LGBTQ plus youths, while only 43% could name any specific supports in the school that were for these students. In addition to that, there were 52% that reported that they were hearing derogatory terms or comments about LGBTQ plus youth at the school. And there was an almost resistance and noting that there was a lack of willingness to engage in actions that might support those rural LGBTQ plus students. And this is another thing that I feel like I've seen myself and is mentioned in the study. And it talks about how rural areas, there is almost a divide in support for LGBTQ plus issues that range from hostile to supportive. And a piece that it mentions, it talks about how they will often, LGBTQ plus community populations will run into sometimes a live and let live attitude, and both experience supportive and derogatory experiences while living there. So I really wanted to frame and connect ethical concerns with the ACA Code of Ethics, and then kind of dive into some possible conflicts, some possible situations that might arise while working with those that fall under these intersecting identities. So a few pieces of the ACA, and I think this can be kind of taken into different forms of support, community support, therapy, other things. But I wanted to touch on a few of the specific codes that I thought were important, and I haven't spoken to about the importance of this. So looking at ACA Code of Ethics A4B, looking at personal values, this just speaks to being aware of and avoiding imposing your own values, attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors on your clients. An important piece of this is that counselors should seek training in areas that they feel like they're at risk of consciously or unconsciously imposing their values. I'll touch on this later, but this is really aware something like a strong use of bracketing would be helpful, engaging in consistent self-reflection and self-exploration helps to combat the unconscious examples of these. The C7A and C7C are ones that I think came out of a place of looking at LGBTQ plus issues and come directly kind of to approach practices like conversion or reparative therapy. And one specific thing that it mentions while talking about these is that there could be a time that a parent or a client requests conversion or reparative therapy. And as a clinician following these codes, it's something that we have to deny. And a big part of that is coming from the idea of like C7A, where we have to provide services that have empirical and scientific foundation or are grounded in theory. And then a huge part of that is that we can't use techniques or modalities that have substantial evidence that suggests harm. And that comes back to it being requested because, well, I think it is on the outs, and I don't think it's as often asked for or even used. Conversion or reparative therapy was something that had a big a push in relatively recent history. One piece that I didn't connect to a specific ACA code, but I think is important for rural settings, is that there is a increased likelihood of having a form of dual relationships. Some of the towns that I've lived in had 3,000 people. Some of them have 500 people. Some of the smaller ones, maybe 200 people. And it becomes much harder to have that distinction of, I'm only going to see this person in session. I'm not going to see them outside of it. And that is something that navigating becomes a bit tougher when we're dealing with communities that we're going to see them at the store. We're going to have a student at their school or a child at their school. And navigating that, I think, in rural environments is a lot tougher than in urban environments where we may see someone at a coffee shop once, and that's really the extent. And I wanted to connect this to LGBTQ plus communities and populations, because there are going to be times that we as clinicians or we as personally are advocating for these communities, whether it be through education or whether it be direct advocation for a client. And there might be some backlash from the community that we have to navigate and that we have to deal with. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the environments that we're hoping to create later on. But one thing that keeping in mind is that there is going to be occasionally people who are continuing to have some negative or derogatory views to LGBTQ, including some of the legislation that's came up in recent years. So some of these possible conflicts or situations that I wanted to touch on and kind of connect those are what I have listed here. So this first example talks about a clinician's values or viewpoints differing dramatically from those of a client. And that's something that I think we've run into sometimes. But the specific example that I wanted to talk about is that there are going to be times that we work with a poly relationship system with a client when a clinician might have only experience with monogamous relationships. And navigating that is something that has to come back to that use of bracketing, the use of self-exploration, and hopefully the use of consulting and supervising. A really big piece, I think, of making these decisions when it comes to care, not just with LGBTQ plus youths, but with a lot of clients, is that when we're looking at treatment options and we're looking at treatment decisions, we have to use some sort of clinical or professional ethical framework to come to those decisions. And I think that's something that even myself, I've tried to explore, and it's not something I'm as comfortable with as maybe other options. So figuring out and identifying ethical frameworks, I think, is really important. So moving on to the second option. So I talked a little bit about a client is experiencing distress because they are not, quotes, out. And if they were to talk about their identity, if they were to identify themselves to family or to their community, they could be kicked out. They could be disowned. And in those cases, we might feel like, in the broader sense, that coming out is important for them. It is an important piece of their life. And as clinicians, we might be, okay, that could be really helpful. Or that they are, right there. They're right about to make that change. They're right about to become vocal about their identity. And it is so important to understand the context of what coming out means and the context that they have to live in. Because I've heard this many times that there is a real concern about kids being disowned, being kicked out if they were to tell their parents of their identity. And just like a secondary part of this is that coming out is just a really personal process, and one that it's recommended that we follow the client's timeline, because we might have some pieces of why they're making those decisions. We might have some pieces of what is happening in their life, but for them to feel comfortable and vocal about their identity, that's something we have to almost leave in their hands and just be supportive of. The next piece that I wanted to touch on is something that I have seen quite a few times in kind of a wide variation of support or non-support, but there are going to be times that an LGBTQ plus teen, their parents aren't supportive of their identity. And I pulled together a resource that I can include, and then we might look at if we have time as we go through this, of a resource guide that is meant to help families in that support and building of that support. And I think this is a really complex situation to work through, because not only are we working on the rapport with, like, if our if the teen is our client, we're working with the rapport of them, but we're also working with the rapport of parents. And navigating that, I think, is a really tough piece of this kind of intersection, especially if we want to touch on the fact that there's a possible dual relationship where the parents might know us, whether it be from, having kids at the same school, whether it be from education that we give them before, or just the fact that we are somewhat prominent in our communities. And this resource that I've included is meant to help families support their LGBTQ plus children, but the goal is not to change the values of the parents, but instead meant to build an alliance to help support the youth. And some of the important pieces that I think are really important to touch on are that with these parents, we really have to meet them where they are. If we were to go to these parents and maybe use the entire sage initialism to start explaining their child's identity, what's going on, I can see that shutting the parents down is just too much information. They're trying to accept too much, and it might be really overwhelming. And so meeting them where kind of their knowledge base is, I think, is really, really important for them to become a sort of support and become a part of that alliance for their youth. A piece of this that I can touch on later too is that acceptance and rejection in the family setting is really important, and it's really something that influences these youth. And so expressing and showing some of the data around that, I think, can be helpful when expressing how positive the acceptance be, and sometimes how harmful just that rejection can be. And I think that rejection also comes in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it will be the outright rejection of the identity as a whole. Sometimes it can be dismissive, just dismissive of the language, dismissive of the experience. Sometimes it can be something like they're unwilling to use specific pronouns, or and I'll touch on this later too, is that there just will be a difference in how that person wants to identify themselves by name, and parents might be unwilling to change their identification. And so finding almost a common ground, but a way to support their youth and help their support system be that support, I think, is really important. So moving on to competencies, what I really wanted to do with this next piece is to pull those ethical considerations, bring them together, and give a sort of framework or some general practices that can be used working with that intersection of rural, youth, and LGBTQ+. So what I did is I kind of brought together these competencies for working with clients as stated by SAGE, and augmented them a little bit to take into consideration some of the rural factors that we deal with as clinicians and the unique factors that come along with rural clients when it comes to access to care, travel, communities around them. And so I wanted to start with awareness. And this really starts as a continued effort as a clinician to kind of confront our biases, to look at our internalized socialization, and to really just kind of connect where our own identity interacts with those around us. And this is really important, I think, for the LGBTQ plus youth, because it is something that they are exploring on their own. And if we're not willing to take a look at our own identities and identify those and kind of put words to them and explore how those interact with the world around it, it might be really tough to work with these communities too. And I wanted to just touch on that this can also be help grown through conversations with those that are in these communities, building knowledge, whether that be through things like webinars, conferences, reading of current research, and giving ourselves time for just some dedicated self-reflection, and kind of building on that knowledge, building on that awareness that helps build our knowledge. A step is just working to be aware of current issues that affect the community. As I mentioned, things like webinars, readings, and something that I think has become increasingly important that we dive into is being aware of legislation that impacts these communities. And this is something that is countrywide. It's something that you have to look at state to state. And I also think it's something that we have to look at possibly like domino effects of, so this legislation was put forward in one state, my state tends to follow it. My state tends to look at these too. I should be aware that this might come up. And I think this has really came out in recent years with several states putting forward legislation talking about just LGBTQ plus education, sexual education, the use of pronouns, pushes in current states to not maybe provide gender affirming care, or states that are making legislations related to trans rights. And the thing with rural practice is that as rural clinicians, we're not going to have as much access to in-person conferences. We're not going to have like nearby groups that are as easy to access as some urban or suburban areas. And so for us, I think that's a bit of extra effort on our end to find ones online or to travel to get that information where we might not otherwise have it. The next piece I wanted to touch on really comes back to that idea of making decisions about your identity, coming out with those decisions. And I really brought this together as acknowledging, validating, and allowing. And so acknowledging, I think I would really define as looking at the process that they're going through, giving the power to the individual, and just acknowledging the importance of the decision they're making, acknowledging how stressful that can be, which goes straight into validating, which is validating that struggle as they navigate those processes and how they navigate the systems around them, whether it be that their school system, whether it be their family systems, or just their larger community, and how that comes into play with their identity, with acceptance, with discrimination they might experience. And then allowing them is really, really important, I think, because a big part of LGBTQ plus identities is that it's often a very personal experience, and there's a personal definition. I think as clinicians, we tend to want specific definitions. We tend to want something that we can look back at and have an answer to specifics, and that's not always going to be the case. Kind of moving on to supportive environments. And I think these last three are where the rural piece of this comes in. Because we have our clinics, we have different clinic spaces, and a very kind of simple way to start that supportive environment is to display just LGBTQ plus supportive literature and posters. And I think a possible issue that comes up with that, both in urban and rural areas, is that we might have other clients in, we might have adults come in that are concerned. They might be upset that they see these posters, and that confrontation or that conversation is something that we almost have to be comfortable with, because while it might be a point of contention, a point of being upset for those adults, for those that fall into these communities, this would be just an immediate non-vocal showing of support when they're entering an unfamiliar environment like our clinics, and gives them kind of this immediate idea that, oh, I can be accepted here. Like, this is going to support who I am, where they might not have as much experience with that in other places. Going further into that, I think it's important that we continue with acknowledging Definitely acknowledging that there is a different intersection of identities. We can start with a piece of LGBTQ plus intersecting with rural and with different intersecting identities. Like I'd mentioned earlier, something like Twin Spirits, there's the intersecting identity of being Native American, LGBTQ plus, living in a rural place. And acknowledging that and being able to have a conversation about that might be important for them to not only have a better understanding of themselves, but also deal with some of the factors around them that there might be some frustration with. I think a big piece of this in terms of continuing the supportive environment is to take into consideration staff pieces of this, not just clinician pieces. Whether that be kind of a push to say, hey, let's get some continuing education talking about LGBTQ plus, or confirming willingness with LGBTQ plus staff to speak with those other staff members about LGBTQ plus issues. Refraining from sending all LGBTQ plus clients to someone who is LGBTQ or to someone who has experience with LGBTQ, because these are LGBTQ plus is a lot of different communities. And just because someone has experience with one of these communities doesn't mean that immediately goes to another one. I think there is an acknowledgement that in rural areas, clinicians, if we don't feel as comfortable with LGBTQ plus in terms of our expertise and working with these clients, that we're not going to have the ability to always refer them to a clinician that is extremely experienced, that only works with LGBTQ plus, just because the lack of mental health practitioners in rural areas. Moving along to the ethical practice, this I think really just comes back to the ACA Code of Ethics, taking those forwards, taking those into consideration, and collaborating and consulting when we feel unsure as clinicians. And a piece of this that I wanted to put in is that it's also important that we do take kind of active steps for advocating and look at our place as clinicians in terms of how do I advocate for LGBTQ plus clients? Is it just through individual advocation with things that they're dealing with? Is it more vocal, more community-based advocation that could create more of that supportive environment? Society and culture is something that I think I put a lot of focus on today in terms of what we want to keep into consideration. Part of that is that there are histories to what these communities have gone through, histories to the language, and it is a developing language that we go through. In rural areas, we need to be aware of the socialization that we experience, that our clients experience, and that those clients' family members or their support systems also experience, and what that means for them when they're exploring their identity. A piece of that is being aware that we often have a sort of heteronormative assumption built into our language, built into our views that we have to be aware of and kind of touched on. A piece of this too is further than what I was talking about earlier when it comes to being aware of the legislation that is around LGBTQ plus issues, but to be aware of community events, community culture, rural culture close to us, because that can move at a completely different pace. That can be a completely different thing. It can have issues that you're only going to find on like a Facebook social media group in your area, or your newspaper, or the radio shows that are playing in your area. And those are ones that I think as people that lived in urban areas, it's something a little harder to track because we're not maybe as in tune with the small town kind of ideas and communication styles that aren't as practiced in urban areas. Here, I just wanted to kind of touch on what I had explored earlier with some general practices as a clinician when working with these populations, and some small things that we might run into when working in the rural areas. The self-awareness piece is something that I think is really important as clinicians that we kind of watch for, because we do sometimes use like unnecessary gendered language or outdated terms. And as I mentioned earlier, and as the next piece touches on, this can be frustrating. And what I like to lay out here is just if there is a time that you use an incorrect term, catching it, replacing it, and then practicing it while trying to remove yourself from the judgment or from any shame that comes from the mistakes that we made. As I talk about preparing for the imperfection that we're going to run into, the language is changing rapidly, and it's not as easy to track. It might be frustrating when we make mistakes, and it's okay to make the mistake, move forward, and correct yourself. And I think this is something that we can also do with our practices, is that if we hear terms that are maybe derogatory or outdated that other clinicians might know of, giving them a gentle nudge might be an appropriate place. Coming back to those assumptions that we talked about earlier, being aware of them, actively taking the steps to ask them, what their name is, what they identify as, using their name directly when they say it if we don't know their pronouns. So that gives them a chance to share. And I think that this is something that like cis clinicians could be really aware of, because there's sometimes a feeling of, my pronoun isn't really important to me. Like I think I've heard people kind of explain that it's visible. They feel like they don't need to, but using the pronouns yourself in your introduction can give an opening to your client that might fall into the LGBTQ plus communities to say, oh, hey, this person's being aware of this. Maybe I can bring this up too. And so asking them their names and pronouns explicitly, it can be an important step. And one piece of this that I think is really important is that we often have to use the language that that these clients put out for us, because they're going to have possibly a different definition than we might have for their identity. And this is something that we kind of have to be flexible with, because correcting them might not be good for rapport. It might hurt that rapport. It might be something that causes that rupture early in a relationship if we're trying to specifically define. And so going kind of with the flow there is important. And just asking them their specific identifiers and moving forward. Something that I included in this is being aware of dead names, which is just kind of a term used when someone is transitioning, whether it be through identity, whether it be with gender. And it's something that we need to be aware of, because they might have a different legal name. They might have a different name on some of the paperwork, but that's not what their preferred name is. And using their preferred name in sessions is important. But I think a piece of the morality in this is looking at a conversation with the clients about what they want to be called in public settings, what they want to be called in front of their parents if they are not publicly out. One thing that I just included that I didn't include in the slide is living in rural areas, we may have to kind of open our support for resources, open the scope, because we might not have a support group in our town. We might not have it in the town next to ours. And so finding digital ones, finding other ones that are more open, I think is important, specifically in rural areas. And I think that comes to questions. I will go ahead and stop my sharing and look at those.
All right. Well, we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A, and please feel free to add more if you think of them while we're answering these. The first is a comment. Michael Getman says, I like what you said about actually advocating for individuals who are being marginalized, discriminated, and or being stigmatized by society. I also see this as an ethical duty as well. And then our first question comes from Dr. Ali Dalitza. She says, for the child that is disowned or kicked out, can you speak to the role that protective services might need to play, or how a therapist would navigate making the decision to call on the parents for refusing to house or support their child?
So this is, I think, one of the toughest situations that we run into because getting that support is something that can be really helpful for the client, the youth, and something that the parents really might have a fight against. And I think our best bet in these situations is to even just make a tentative call to like a protective, those systems, and to see, I don't see it being harmful, just to see if there's anything that can be done. And those conversations with the parents are going to be hard to approach because I had spoken to kind of finding them where they're at. And it sounds like parents in those situations are very much having a hard time accepting any piece of it, any piece of the identity, any piece of the experience. And so I think I'll include it in with the resources, is just a little bit of a resource guide that touches on the further exploration of what that might look like, because it is a complicated piece. And I think it's something that a lot of consulting, a lot of supervising, if possible, with people around you is helpful, partially just for some direction, but also help for possible resources that we might not always be aware of that others know. I do really appreciate that question, though.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And actually, there was another one on a similar vein, but instead of if the youth is kicked out, they wanted to know if the youth finds themselves in a toxic or non-supportive home environment, would it be possible for a clinician to report domestic abuse? And if so, what effect might this have on the client? Would it be helpful or hurtful?
I think this does come back to the idea that I think as clinicians and as practitioners are okay to reach out with these calls that we're unsure of to these support services. I don't think there's always going to be a right answer for these, whether it fully counts. And I think there's going to be a lot of context to these situations that are important when we're exploring them. And there are going to be times where it's possibly not abusive, but the support isn't there and it's hurting the client, but it might not end up having any sort of action that comes into place if a call is made. And so giving our support however we can in sessions and seeing about community support, I think is important there. I think a lot of these coming back to is it's okay to make calls. It's okay to see if like with the services, if it's appropriate or not, because I think for the most part, they're going to give you a pretty direct answer of like, okay, we can look into this. Okay, we can't look into this. And I think when we're making any calls that could create a like a removal from home or something that can come back and that the clients are aware that it came from us, there might be a rupture that we have to deal with the clients. There might be a rupture we deal with the parents. And that's something that we have to kind of just approach in the same way that we would if it was a different kind of child protector services call.
All right, well, that was all of our